so I am so excited to moderate the first of 2 debates today. And I know all of our debaters are ready and excited. They have their notepads. They're set to go. They're going to challenge each team. I'm going to do introductions in just a second, but what I wanted to do with our audience, and hopefully the people who are watching online can contribute as well, is I want to get each of you to answer this question and see if you are on team yes or team no, okay? So our debate question that we are going to dive into is all about the future of cyborgs. So the question is this: would you trade your biological parts for bionic ones? How many people in the audience say yes? A raise of hands and drop yes in the chat if you're watching online. Yes? Okay, maybe Ramsey can help me get a sort of rough count here. Okay, I have to say, if you keep your hands up, please. This is a lot more people than I would have thought. Wow. Okay, and what about the no's in the audience? Okay, so. Yeah, this is interesting. Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. And to our audience members who are watching virtually, please drop your yeses or your nos into the chat and let us know. Again, the question, if you missed it, is would you trade your biological parts for bionic ones? So let us know with a yes or a no. So we're going to start with about the next 15, 20 minutes with opening statements from each of our debaters. And I want you guys to be able to follow along as easily as possible. So I want you to know that the no's are on this side of the stage and the yeses are on that side of the stage. So let's start with our team no and do some introductions. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves after I say your name and title and tell me a little more about what you do. I'm going to start with Team No, Dr. Tracy Trothan, Professor of Ethics, jointly appointed to the School of Rehabilitation Therapy and School of Religion. So Tracy, tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Well, I'm a professor, as you were saying, Amber, here at Queen's University, and I teach courses in the area of everything from technology and religion to sport and religion to ethics and aging. So I teach in the interdisciplinary program at School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's in health and aging. And I have a great interest in where we're going with AI and what the ethical issues are there, and also asking questions about how technological advances are going to be affecting our spiritualities.
Very interesting. All right. So again, that is Tracy on Team No. And Lane, you are the CEO of Nudge BG and Queen's Engineering alumnus. Nudge BG is an engineering consulting services and algorithm development company focused on modeling, simulation, and control of physiological systems. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
I think you just said it all.
That's it. That's it.
I'm a proud Queen's alumni, chemical engineer, and spent the last 30 years doing automation in various industries, most recently in medical devices and specifically automated insulin delivery for people with type 1 diabetes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here. Then we're going to switch over to introductions for Team Yes. First up, we have Dr. Audrey Settle, Assistant Professor at McGill University. Audrey's work incorporates continuum mechanics and machine learning to improve the design and control of soft robots. Anything to add to that, Audrey?
Yeah. A soft robot is a robot that is made out of materials that are soft and compliant. It's a class of devices that have a lot of promise, but somehow haven't really made it out of the lab yet. I think one reason for that is that the design and control of them is so fundamentally different from, for instance, that Husky over there, that people don't really have the engineering frameworks yet to make that happen. And that's the problem that I'm interested in.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. And our second person on Team Yes is Dr. Matthew Robertson, Assistant Professor in Mechanical and Materials Engineering here at Queen's, and Mitchell Professor in Soft and Multi-Material Robotics. Anything to add?
Yeah, I'm another soft roboticist. My areas of interest are, due to the nature of soft robotics being mostly compliant robots, they're really amenable to human-robot interaction type applications. And I'm also very interested in ways to use compliance in mobile, more robust systems. So to leverage the benefits of the compliance of the robot being a really squishy machine rather than these hard, rigid structures we usually think of as a robot, like a C-3PO, moving towards something more like a Baymax. If you've ever seen the movie Big Hero 6, is sort of my dream to make that come true. So something a little bit more human friendly, a little bit more amenable to use in our daily lives is what I hope to achieve in my research.
Excellent. I think we should have a big round of applause for all of our debaters. Yes, and feel free to get nice and close to those microphones so everybody who's watching online and is in the room can hear you well. So what we're going to do is we're going to give each of our debaters about 5 minutes for some opening statements. I'm actually going to time this so we make sure that nobody goes over time, so it's a fair debate. And we are going to start with Team No. And Tracy, we're going to start with you. So I'm going to, are you all set? No pressure.
I'm feeling the pressure.
I know. I want everyone to feel the pressure, right? So, all right. So, Tracy, let's go. Team No, your argument starts now. 5 minutes on the clock.
Okay. Humans should not replace their biological parts with bionic parts for many, many reasons. And I'm going to just highlight 3 areas of these reasons. The first one is to do with social justice and what it means to be fixed. If we make it normal to replace our parts, bionic parts, every part from limbs right through to major organs, then we have to ask a lot of questions that we haven't really done well with socially yet. And that is, what is a disability? What needs fixing? What doesn't need fixing? So if we're talking, for example, about cochlear implants and deaf culture, to make the assumption that everyone wants to hear and not be part of deaf culture is a very wrong assumption and could do a lot of damage and does do a lot of damage. Another question is aging an illness or a disability? So are we going to want to promote replacement parts for us as we age? If aging is framed as an illness, then we will do this. If it's not, then we're going to do something else. So we risk developing more ageism in our society, because if people appear to be older and they don't get fixed, that could be a problem. Stereotypes and stigma, let's keep building on this. We could develop some very unrealistic high expectations of people who have visible bionic parts and therefore not give them the help that they need or would benefit from. There's also the risk of stigmas. We're seeing when people use robots that some others stigmatize them as being weird, odd. So what's going to happen with that unless we unpack our prejudices and attitudes? Allocation and access to bionic parts. The cost of bionics is not cheap yet, as we well know. So who can afford this? This threatens to widen the gap between the privileged and the unprivileged. Who gets it? Who gets it first? Who doesn't get it? Is it just about money? Or is it about something else? Really at the heart of this is who is a valuable human being and how do we decide that intentionally? And what happens when the tech for these bionic parts becomes obsolete? It's a tough thing to look at implants and decide what we do, especially if we think about the future with replacing major organs. What happens in that case? Maybe regulatory bodies will keep up with that, maybe they won't. Other question is, in a social justice vein, when there's so many people in the world who are without basic needs, shelter, water, food, education, why would we be pouring finances and other resources into bionic parts? Ontological questions, that's the second category of questions that I want to just mention briefly about what it means to be human and what we want to preserve about being human. Some bionic parts are clearly performing a therapeutic function, like pacemakers, and they're widely available and accessible to people in many countries, and are provided for those people who need them. But the parts that are more enhancing and not clearly life-saving are going to be catering more to the privileged in our society. So again, we risk widening that gulf between the privileged and the unprivileged. I want to ask too how our bionic parts will affect our spiritualities and our identities. So at what point do we become no longer us? What makes us us? Do we think that everything about us and our consciousness is located in our brain? Or is our mind bigger than our brain? Is our person bigger than our brain? Artists, sports athletes, others know that there's something more than just our brains when we act, when we engage in what we do best. So when we take off parts of us and other cells that aren't just in our brain, what do we do to our identity?
About 50 seconds left.
We have to ask that. And we need to be intentional about our core values, and we're often not. And are we afraid of death? And if so, why? And then there are the physical harms. What are the potential physical consequences that we don't want? And one last thought, hackers. What do we do about people who can hack into all these devices like pacemakers? A great way to assassinate someone.
That went dark fast. All right. You finished just under time. So thank you so much for that. We're going to go to Lane next, but I do want to remind everybody that what we're going to do is get each of the teams to kind of challenge the other team. So they're going to be paying attention to the no team and see what they have to say. And I think Lane, although this wasn't so fair for Tracy, I'm going to put the clock right in front of you if you think you need it. Just
I've
so
got a timer.
You got it? Oh, of course you do. All right. All right. So Lane, let's get started.
So first of all, I say that Tracy and I didn't collude, but it will appear so by my comments shortly. So first of all, 50 years ago, growing up, watching TV, one of my favorite shows was The $6 Million Man, all about the bionic man and an astronaut who had a crash and had some parts replaced and was bionic. So now we play this forward 50 years, and here I find myself working on automated insulin delivery. One of the companies in the automated insulin delivery space is called Beta Bionics. Beta cells are the cells that are destroyed when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So it's come full circle for me that in the space that I currently participate in, there's about 1 million people benefiting from this automated insulin delivery technology now. And I just wanted to share a couple perspectives, a couple thoughts about this. So first of all, when we're talking about these bionic replacement parts, is this a voluntary or involuntary decision? In the case of people with insulin requiring diabetes, they had no choice. They were involuntarily required to adopt these technologies. That has profound implications. Another question about bionic aspects of replacement parts is it a restorative or is it an enhancing technology? And certainly in the case of my space with automated insulin delivery, it's intended to be restorative. But for those of you who might have seen these white things on the back of people's arms, those are continuous glucose monitors. So that's a key component of an automated insulin delivery technology. What happens when people are now using those for enhancement of their performance in things like sports? That raises implications of, is it unfair? Is it a performance enhancing? Things like the Tour de France now ban those. And there's also a very big pushback from the type 1 diabetes community about basically the gamification and the use of a critical medical technology in their minds for fun or profit or some other less noble pursuit. Is the bionic part visible or invisible? So a pacemaker is invisible. Nobody knows you have it. You don't even know you have it, except you live 15 years longer. For some of these technologies, it's very obvious. It's very obvious that and now you have this challenge of being labeled with a chronic disease because you've got this thing that is strange and invites questions. If you're in a school cafeteria, you don't want to be different. You don't want something beeping and buzzing like the mandatory alarms that are required in some of these automated insulin delivery systems. So again, there's profound implications about, is it a visible or an invisible technology? And then that starts to have an effect on people's identity. Is their identity as a student or a bus driver, and now their identity is as somebody with a disability or a chronic disease? And I've seen crazy things like people naming their assistive technologies. Their pump is called Bob or Buzzy. They're tattooing images of their medical devices on their bodies. They're letting their children select the technologies based on color or form factor rather than function because of the parental guilt of their child being diagnosed with diabetes. Does it provide better or worse function? And certainly in the case of automated insulin delivery, you're trying to do the job of an endocrine system which has multiple actuators with a single actuator. Very challenging with that. Some of these early technologies are largely designed by engineers or doctors, not by people with diabetes. And there are consequences of that. So for instance, when I was working at Medtronic 12 years ago, and we launched the very first step towards automated insulin delivery, and we're calling it an artificial pancreas, there was huge pushback from the community saying, that's not an artificial pancreas. It only does one aspect of what it takes for me to manage my disease. And so that's why there was a rebranding of this technology to automated insulin delivery versus being an artificial pancreas. The unhappy path. So we think about the happy path of these technologies. What happens when you need cloud connection and you go camping or you go on an airplane or Hurricane Fiona hits and you're without power for a week? What happens there? Or the example that Tracy shared of what happens if it's obsolete or the company decides not to be in business anymore or gets divested. So there are huge challenges there. I think I'll end with that. I don't want to.
You ended perfectly on time. Nice job. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So now we're going to switch over to the Yes team, and I'm excited to hear their arguments in terms of their position. Audrey, we're going to start with you. Would you like me to put the clock below so you can see the time?
Yeah, I would really like that. Thank you. Yeah, so I think I want to start with some definitions because when you argue no to something, it's kind of easier to have a vaguer picture of what that is. But when I say yes, I have to say precisely what I want to be saying yes to. So I did Google the terms bionic and cyborg last night, and I came with some definitions that I think are built off of those Merriam-Webster kind of things. So bionic, I'm thinking of some kind of mechatronic device. It's not something that is purely mechanical or just passive. It's something that is maybe kind of doing something. I'm thinking that it's permanently or semi-permanently attached or embedded in my body. It's not something that I can take off at the end of the day when I go to sleep without much effort, like a hat. And I'm thinking that it adds function, perhaps in a restorative capacity, or it augments function that was already there. And that's based on the definition of cyborg, where I think the idea is that these components are upgrading the function that was already there in some way. So under that definition, I'm going to say that, yes, I would replace my biological parts with bionic ones. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that people already are. Many people have gone before me. You've already heard some examples of bionic parts that people use for restorative purposes. They're not always easy. You've also heard that. You have to learn how to manage the device. You might have a custom interface, perhaps even one that's done through targeted reinnervation, where it attaches your nerve bundles directly to that device, such as in a prosthetic. People are doing these already. People are going through the effort of learning how to live their lives with these new devices. And they're saying that it's working for them when given that choice. The government of Canada is funding these types of devices, for instance, through the Indigenous health benefit. They're noting that if a doctor says that there is significant function to be gained and has done a detailed risk-benefit assessment, that these kinds of things can be funded. So this is happening already, and it's happening especially in a restorative or a partially restorative capacity. And I think that in a case where I wanted that kind of restorative stuff to happen, I would definitely go ahead and select a bionic part. There are also areas in my life where I might just accept augmented function from what I have right now. One example of that might be contact lenses that adjust to ambient lighting and allow me better focus. This is something that senses, it plans, it acts. It's kind of robotic in nature. That could be considered to be bionic. Or perhaps something in my mouth that monitors where cavities might be forming. I would really love that. So I could augment my function now. There are examples where I'd want to do that. I could get them restoratively, or there might be situations where I have to in the future. A great example is that, there are now things that we have to have now. We have to have an internet connection to do our jobs. That's not bionic, obviously, but it's something in our lives that, 20 years ago, we might not have said is a necessity, and now it is. Bionics could become necessary in the future. Perhaps people are going to expect certain behaviors from us that require them, or perhaps we're going to need them for personal identification or things of that nature. So let's see, I have 2 more minutes. I think I was going to save this point, but I think in general, I have trust in kind of the medical establishment, which is where we're seeing the forefront of these devices entering. There are lots of different metrics for functions that can be gained for these risk-benefit analyses that are quantitative in nature as well as qualitative, that can be tailored to individuals and their needs, as well as kind of applied across populations to show that they work. I think that in the medical establishment, I have a lot of trust, and also in regulating bodies to kind of answer some of these other questions about how are people going to get it? How is it going to be deployed? What are fair prices? So I'll finish a little bit early, but in conclusion, I would absolutely replace my biological parts with bionic ones.
Thank you so much. All right. So next up, we have Matt. Matt, would you like me to reset the timer just so you have a sense of time?
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
You all set?
I'm all set. Yeah.
Good.
Get this in position. All right. So I'm happy here to speak and continue on this topic, and I'll try to pretty much just segue right off of what Audrey started saying, because we did collude a little bit before this, in all fair honesty, but didn't come to this conclusion, the same conclusions, because we had met beforehand. I think we both came to these conclusions on our own. I think they're pretty strong points. As you could see from some of her discussion, we already sort of do have this systematic approach to creating cyborgs. It's just a long process to get to the point in science fiction that's inspired all of this. I'm a huge science fiction nerd myself as well. So I could bring up $6 Million Man. I could bring up RoboCop. One of my favorite examples, maybe I'll save to my third point, was from a cartoon called Batman Beyond, and it was envisioning a future in the Batman universe of what it would be like to replace your limbs with, beyond your natural function. And I think that's a really intriguing, and albeit in the plot line of the show, sort of a negative consequence. But I think it could open up these really exciting possibilities that we have never even thought of before, without thinking in terms of the context of enhancing our function or replacing our limbs. But I think the main point that we're hearing that on our side is we've already picked the path of the cyborg. I think we are already cyborgs in our own respects. And I think my favorite examples, because I was a dumb phone user until maybe 10 years ago, when I was essentially forced to switch to a smartphone for some of these practical reasons that before you didn't need to have a smartphone. And it was interesting if you had one and fun, but now it's virtually necessary to even log into your own email because you need the multi-factor authentication. And it's becoming more and more ubiquitous and required just to survive in society nowadays. And so this technology, which was at once optional and once debated, I'm sure, on its own merits, has now become an integrated part of our life. And if you just look around society now, get onto any metro system or subway or bus, try to find the one person that's not on their phone. They're probably just in a conversation or with their friends. But anybody who's basically alone waiting in line is essentially glued to their phone. And so that's my argument of why we're already cyborgs, because in a sense, we're starting to replace our senses, trusting this technology, becoming more integrated with these connections that we've formed globally now, which opens up new possibilities. We're not just relying on our own senses, but we can sort of check in on the weather across the globe. So one anecdotal example, and then I'm just as guilty of this myself, but I'll use my wife in this example. When I say, what's the weather like today when I'm packing to leave the house for the day? Is it raining? She'll check her phone before she goes to the window. And I think that's a good subtle example of where we're headed. And this path we've already chosen is that we trust the technology so much that we almost trust it more than ourselves, than our own eyes, because we have the ability to sort of predict the future with our meteorology. So we'd rather go to the phone, we'd rather go to our smartwatch, which is something that's wearable. And wearable systems is another good example of why and how this technology is becoming more of an integrated part of our life. And so it started from the outside, and it's moving closer and closer to our personal sphere, to where now we have this smartwatch, which can not only tell us the weather to save us the trip or the effort of turning around to look out the window, or, to walk to the front door to check if it's raining. It gives us this foresight, but it's also monitoring our vitals, our blood pressure or our blood pulse rate. And I know some people will even wear this to sleep. So that sort of fits the definitions that you just heard of cyborg, where it's not something so simple that you just take off like your shoes or your hat at the end of the day. But some people do opt and choose to make this a part of their everyday being. So all day long, they're measuring their vital signs and in some cases broadcasting them online. But I would argue to that point that was one of the points that I could counter. We don't necessarily need to have this technology uploaded to the cloud like we do with everything nowadays. I'm very much opposed to that. Surprisingly, I'm a roboticist by nature, but I still want to keep my distance from some of this going too far. So I'm not necessarily an advocate of cloud technology. You can maybe get updates some other way. But the second point that I was going to make, and I knew I'd run out of time, is an example of my truck. From a conversation with a mechanic about why I wanted to continue making upgrades to this really old truck. And I basically said I wanted to keep it running as long as I could. And I asked what the limit is and when I should stop making these upgrades and when I should stop investing in this. And he said, practically speaking, you don't have to decide to stop. You can keep a machine running forever, indefinitely. And I think if you think about the prospect of that for people, it's very intriguing to think that maybe with bionic limbs, we could extend our lives a lot longer. So that's all.
Very good. Nicely done. So I'm now going to give each of the teams 5 minutes to challenge the other team on what they just said. So you guys can decide amongst yourselves who you want to ask the question to, or you want to just direct it to the entire team. I'm going to start and get the yes team to challenge the no team to kick things off. So just switch it up a little bit. I'm going to start the timer, although we're not going to be as precise with this one, but let's get into a good conversation. What did you guys think of what the no team had said?
I think they make some okay points. I had one question. It was brought up kind of the look of these multiple times in terms of, is someone going to be othered if they have a visible bionic device? But then also, are people going to make selections of bionic devices based on how they look or the color rather than their function? And I think the way that was said, it was implied that that's a bad thing. But I want to point out that that's something we do already too. We color our hair, we get tattoos, we select our clothing, and some of those things are permanent, some of those things are less permanent. But I would wonder why it's a bad idea to have aesthetic variety in these devices.
So excellent question. I would say it's not a bad idea. It's a thing that shapes and potentially transitions an identity. Okay. And it's a choice that people make quite often. Mm-hmm. And some people don't actually have the choice, that there's a thing on their arm and they can't do anything about it. So it's more about the visible, invisible challenge, that when it's visible, you don't have any choice about it. And so that's why, so it's prom season right now. And there's a whole bunch of pictures on my Facebook feed of prom dresses and people, bling. So this is where they're trying to bring this into their identity. And so I think that's fine. I don't have any, when they have some agency over that. It's when they don't have any agency over that I think we run into the challenge.
I would echo the same thing. So if somebody needs a robot to help them and is basically attached to that robot, it's like a technological enhancement. If they need the robot in order to function, then they don't have as much choice, especially as it becomes more and more normative that everybody will do these things. And we're seeing some study results that are suggesting that people do pay a price, being stigmatized when they need something visible. But if it's a choice and it's fun, then I think that you're right. So maybe we can move more in that direction.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just to add on to that. I can think of some examples where things aren't a choice. And I think it was brought up before. We don't want to define what broken is for people, especially if we're trying to avoid the stigma of that. But there are some cases I can imagine, like if you, where you kind of need this equipment, and just even mobility scooters or walkers give you the ability, and you essentially need that to be able to locomote from one point to another. And then it's not so much defining broken, it's defined itself by necessity if I want to survive and if I'm alone. So if I live alone and I need to get to the kitchen to eat some food or go to bed or use the bathroom or something like that, it's not so much that it's being defined for us, but like a priori at the beginning, we could start by saying there are certain functions we need just to get by. And it's not chosen for us. But I hope that we would move past, I think the example of tattoos and hair coloring is a good one, where at different points in time that's viewed with sort of a different bias. And I think we're becoming, it's a changing phenomenon, how we accept these things or reject them. And I'm hoping that that can be something that we also just move past and evolve with in terms of accepting those differences among us. And I think if anything, it's even more important to show the difference and make it visible. That way we get to the heart of, again, another thing that was brought up, what it means to be human. So we really focus on the human side of things. What part of this man-machine interface is the human? And it's not because they have a leg or don't have a leg, or have this different kind of a leg or different skin color, things like that. We might focus more, in the case of a world of cyborgs, on what inherently makes us human rather than less, like we currently do.
Excellent. Did you want to respond to that? Any response?
Sure, quick response. We could move in the direction of focusing more and more on what it means to be human and a diverse human, or the possible downside is that with the technology, we decide what differences aren't acceptable. And we create just the different things that a certain select group of people decide are acceptable. So that a bionic leg may become acceptable because we promote it and we make it accessible to people. We make it look cool. We have advertising, but it may not be acceptable if someone chooses to not have a bionic leg. So what do we do with that?
Matt and Audrey, do you have any more questions?
No, I was actually going to sort of agree and give you a half a point there by saying I've been through this before with the smartphone debacle, and I still sort of catch that if anybody, and we have people here, even at Queens and colleagues that I know that don't carry a smartphone regularly, and you get a second look when somebody says, "I don't have a smartphone." Really? How could you not have a smartphone? So I can imagine this is a possibility, to be fair.
Excellent. Great questions. Before we go to questions from the other team, want to remind the audience that after that, I'm going to come out to you for your questions. So please think about some questions, and we'll have a few minutes for our audience to have Q&A and challenge each of our teams on some of the comments they made, or agree with them if that's how you feel. All right. So we are going to come to Team No and see if you have any questions for Team Yes. About 5 minutes on the clock.
I have a quick one, maybe. It gets to the concept of scale and regulation and how you take these from small scale academic to wide scale, and particularly as Tracy identified, we've got this thing like called the inverse care law, where the people who need the technology most are the ones least able to access it. The strong bias in clinical trials around rich white people having access to it, and the disadvantaged, less socioeconomically advantaged not having that. And then the regulatory. So I have a very different perspective on regulatory than perhaps you do.
Trusting them unquestioningly.
And the point is, when you bring a new technology to a regulator, it's not like they have a team waiting for a new technology. They have to organically build it. And this has been my experience that is where things are falling down from a scaling perspective, is the regulators don't know how to regulate these things yet. And when they don't know how, and public health is at risk, they move very slowly. And this again gets to the question of scale. How do you scale these technologies and make them accessible to everybody, and most importantly, the people who will benefit most from them?
It's not a question that I have a great answer to. I think part of it is it has a lot to do with who the healthcare providers are and what their opinions are. and also what metrics they're using. So I did know that there are, different kind of metrics for regain of function. Some are qualitative, some are quantitative. They're kind of very based on patients and their context, which is a great thing. But I think what we could try to do is demand of healthcare professionals to balance those two things: the specific stuff for the patient, the specific assessment, and general assessments, and to kind of write in detail and communicate in detail arguments for why someone would need something like this. I don't know exactly how you would encourage that communication, but that's what I would like to see happen.
Yeah. So my response, I guess, is from the second half of the point, less from the regulatory side, but more from the practical standpoint. You brought up economics, which is a very valid point. And how would you scale this and get it out to the world in a more, I would say, equitable way? How to get everybody access to the same kind of technology if they so choose. So give them the choice. How do you get access to that? And I would say we don't have a perfect system for that already, but we face these problems outside of cyborgs already. But if you remove yourself from the health industry and just consider technology in general, it's almost indispensable now to get by. As I keep bringing up with smartphones and computers, and when laptops were first available, they weren't available to everybody. And those who had it had an advantage. You could bring it home, you could carry it with you, you could go to conferences. And it inspired these other incentives and other programs. And that then was born like the $100 laptop, which I think came out of MIT, which is an initiative to provide laptops to other countries at really minimal cost, at least to those investing. And in the country, $100 is a lot of money. But I imagine that it would have to happen over a period of time, but you could still evolve in the same way, along the same lines that we've seen with smartphones, which, again, everybody has some sort of a smartphone now, or access to these low-cost phones available under different plans. So you might subscribe to a service plan. And it's a little scary to think that your heart or your pacemaker is a subscription. But with the right development of the healthcare system in pace with the technology, then the cost of the actual individual items almost becomes negligible, because phones can be bought and included as part of these service packages for essentially free or pennies. So I imagine that we could get past that hurdle through these sort of systematic approaches that we already use.
Other questions?
One more question. So I take your points that we are already cyborgs for sure. I mean, even the act of wearing glasses, right? That is technology interfacing with our bodies. But the question is, how far do we go with it? And at what point, if any, do we cease to be who we are? And do we want to continue to be who we are? Is there something valuable in that or not? If I replace most of my parts or all of my parts with bionic parts, eventually as they become available, so I can live for 500 years or more indefinitely, depending upon accidents, et cetera. If I lose all of the parts that are me right now, do I lose, what's consciousness, right? Do I lose my consciousness? Do I lose me? So how far do we go with this?
Don't our cells get replaced pretty frequently? Like I get a new skin every 2 weeks or something. And that actually has been a question that's given me pause. If my cells are getting replaced, am I still me? But I think, and this is in my opinion, as answering the question, would I replace my biological parts? If I get to decide what those parts are, or if a healthcare practitioner, suggests those bionic parts as part of healthcare in some way, then I think that is integral to me, because it's something that I determined that I wanted to have.
I'm really excited about this question, because I have my favorite answer to this, which is a counter question, which is, could you love a robot? Which is sort of related to the same thing. And this came up because of a news story I read recently about the way we're going in virtual reality. And so the extreme of being a cyborg would be, would you give up your entire existence and body if you could download your brain into a computer? And there are already people, I think, wishing and dreaming and hoping they could do that, and doing the best they can in that regard with virtual worlds. And there's a whole industry springing up now through NFTs and blockchain technology as part of the reasoning that this has become possible. But there are these virtual worlds that are becoming very prominent. Meta, Facebook has rebranded itself a few times, chasing this dream. And there's even stories of Instagram influencers or TikTok influencers accounts, which are entirely artificial. some driven by AI, some with some invisible hand behind the scenes driving some of it. But the discussions people are having are leading to these relationships with influencers that don't actually exist. And it's interesting to question that and say whether that's a real feeling or it's a real relationship. If it's understood that it's something artificial, but you just have this bond and you can have a communication and you get this, the same effect you get from talking to a friend across the world. You could argue it doesn't really matter if you're talking to a human, as long as you forge that connection. And the human part of it is just the experience of the interaction. And maybe we could potentially love a machine. There's already people who do.
Yes.
I have so many questions, but it's not my job to ask questions up here. Nonetheless, great challenges to each team. Now, as I mentioned, I want to give the audience about 10 minutes or so, maybe 15, if you have some really good questions. I think they were pretty nice to each other, and it's a pretty healthy debate. So let's continue that trend, but let's have some challenging questions. Right there with the glasses on your head, and yeah, great. Ramsey's going to bring over the mic so our awesome audience online is able to hear the questions. Well, feel free to direct it to a team or a person, whatever works for you.
Sure. Okay. I think this is for both teams.
Oh, do you want to stand up just so the camera can see you?
Can do. Okay. So for both teams, I'm curious from your side, what are the insurance implications of yes or no? Thinking about the insurance industry and also the idea that bionic parts have that ability to do data collection. And so whether we're talking about privacy or on the one hand, or maybe on the other hand, thinking more about incentivizing people towards better health, what are the pros and cons of bionic prosthetics in the context of insurance?
Sure. Maybe one member per team could answer and represent your team.
Trying to pass it off.
I'm happy to do
first.
Okay, Lane, why don't we start with you for team
Sure.
no?
So first of all, insurance is all about risk, and risk is all about who accepts it, who carries the risk, and this is a profound question in automated insulin delivery, because automated insulin delivery takes a human task of sensing, deciding, acting, and says, now a medical device will do that. And now you have, because of this task transfer, two other parties now involved in this. And it's sad and tragic, but regulators don't actually care if you are killing yourself with insulin. You walk out of the hospital with a vial of insulin and a sliding scale table that says good luck with this deadly drug. You are held to a different level as a medical device company and a regulator, because now those two entities are on the hook for this risk. And that leads to some very counterproductive behaviors, some delays in therapy, access. So it's an excellent question, and it's unresolved. So another example is malpractice insurance for doctors, right? So if a doctor does something, they are subject to malpractice. That's a different thing than a medical device company making the same mistake. So when you talk about decision support systems, a doctor can be making unsafe decisions all day long and causing risk and harm. The same exact scenario will be held to a different standard if it's now a medical device or a decision support system that a medical device company or software as a medical device is trying to do. So you bring up an excellent point, and it's unresolved right now and very frustrating for people with chronic diseases to manage.
I'll start by addressing the insurance question. I thought of a number of different kinds of insurance, including ones that are maybe different across the world. So health insurance was the first one that I thought of. You know, obviously the doctor is going to, maybe they're going to bill a public payer, or the practitioner is going to maybe bill a private insurance company for the cost of these things. And that has been, at least I know for prosthetics, that has been an issue for some people where they, you know, the one that they want is not covered under their insurance. I think that is not good, obviously. I think that people should be able to access the devices that they want to have under their insurance, whatever scheme that might be. But I don't think that this would preclude, you know, would I get one? Should people be allowed to have them? It's the opposite, even though I don't quite have the answer for how to reform insurance policies around the world to get there. The other kinds of insurances that you were talking about are more around malfunction of the devices and the consequences of those. I think that Lane gave a great answer there, so I won't address that. And then the last question that you were asking about was collecting data and using that to encourage people. We do that with cars. People have to, for the cheapest insurance now, apparently you have to put the smartphone in your car. And if you accelerate too hard, then you have to pay $100 more. I don't know the details of this, but I have heard that happening. People do this in employment situations too. If I put on my pedometer and I walk 20,000 steps or whatever, maybe my company is going to give me a little prize or a bonus. That's actually not about the information collection. To me, that's about the information sharing, which is a different kind of question. If there are infrastructures there for keeping privacy, and I will know that there are legal infrastructures for healthcare privacy, then it's not clear to me how those collection mechanisms can exist if they're going to be in violation of the privacy law that's already there.
If I could just pile onto the data, because I'm glad you brought that point up. This is a huge challenge. These are all data generating technologies. And the question is, who owns that data? And there are specific examples of these continuous glucose monitoring companies where they're reselling patient data to partners like Garmin, like my watch, and denying access to the person with diabetes of their own data. That's playing out right now. So I'm glad you brought that point up. It's my disease. It's my data. I should be able to do with it what I want, when I want.
Yeah, the issue, the ethics of the safeguarding of personal data, health data, and otherwise is just becoming more and more complex with AI. I'm just think of Siri or Alexa, right? If you say something at the start of the day about, I'm thinking about buying a new car, what do you think? And you have a conversation. Then all of a sudden later on the day on your phone, ads are popping up all over the place for cars. And you're thinking, but how did they get that? Well, maybe you're not thinking that, but a lot of people are, right? Because it's not all totally transparent about what we're buying into. And some of that is because we fail to take responsibility for that, but others of it is because companies are taking advantage of a certain gap in our regulatory systems.
Great book on that topic. I don't know if you follow Cory Doctorow. He talks a lot about surveillance capitalism, but he has a new book out called Choke Point Capitalism, and it's excellent. And he talks a lot about that. Oh my goodness, there's so many questions. We definitely have time. Do you know who was next? All right.
Hi, thank you so much for that great debate. Surprisingly, an angle that didn't come up during the debate was freedom of choice. And so I want to ask about that. And the fact that the question was basically phrased, would you choose to swap your biological limbs for bionic? And I think that's a perfectly fine question. The people for the motion will choose to do so, and the ones against can choose not to. But my question is for the people against the motion. And so do you think that it is okay for people who want to do so to have control over their body and do that, or should that be banned in a regulatory perspective?
So I think that's a great question. And choice is something that in our culture is so significant right now that if I choose something, it should be okay and it should be up to me. Trouble is, of course, when I make a choice, it doesn't just affect me. It affects a lot of other people around me. So what are the spin-off effects? Is it going to matter that I opt or don't opt for a bionic part so I live shorter or longer? What are the implications there? And also, not everybody can make the same choice, right? So maybe I can make a choice because I can find the financial resources that I need. I can find access to facilities and availability of technology, and I know how to navigate systems reasonably well, or I know who to talk to help me. But not everybody has access to those same resources. So again, is it okay that I can make the choice, but that somebody else does not have the same tools and resources to make that choice, or the same money to make that choice?
Go ahead.
We have talked about, I don't think I've actually addressed that, or that our team has addressed, this priority, who gets it first kind of thing. But Matt alluded to it really well. And I just want to highlight that again. if there is mass adoption of technologies, and if people choose to purchase them, costs can come down over time. And it can create a situation where something that now is not very accessible financially to most people could become in the future if we allocate resources toward developing it with that goal.
I was going to, take this opportunity to make this maybe even more controversial and introduce another debate to this debate. I would say, even as an adopter, an early adopter, I would take the bionic body parts any day. I want to see how long I can live and see what the future has. I want like hoverboards and flying cars, and so whatever gets me there to see this happen. But at the same time, I would hold off on letting it be a complete free-for-all. And so this is getting to the idea of not just emulating and replacing our function, but what if we could augment our function? And so for little things or slippery slopes of sports contests, enhancing athletes to make them run faster or whatever. But this starts to edge a little closer into the gun control debate. So will you let people with augmented bionic limbs have knives for hands or a chainsaw arm? Right. There's probably a limit we want to impose at some point. So even as an adopter, I would say we still need to develop and start thinking about, because I do think this is probably inevitable. This is coming our way anyway. As soon as we figure out this direct connection, innervation of connecting machines to our nervous system directly, we can get more and more functionality out of these devices. We have maybe a few more degrees of freedom that we can control from our minds directly, if we're not just replacing the single degrees of freedom from our limbs, to have these augmented devices that are part of us. And so I can't imagine the sort of control debates that are going to happen in the future over is a knife arm okay? Is a shotgun arm okay? Like, where is the limit between, if you want to say that your arms are weapons? I'm sorry I keep bringing up weapons, but this is, again, my Batman Beyond reference. You should all search Batman Beyond. I forget the name of the episode. I wish I had written it down, but I encourage you. YouTube's got it. So you'll understand more what
I feel like we're just crafting the next debate topic, right? Okay, it's happening. Question.
Hello. So I was kind of wondering both teams' perspectives on how art and fashion would kind of play into this bionic role, and how, for example, there could be positive and negative impacts from the aesthetics and personal expression. So I was wondering if both teams had an opinion and could share them on that matter.
Who wants to take that one?
I'll start by saying there's already people moving in that direction. There are some model. There's a model, if I don't remember her name, but she's already sort of forging that path, the forefront of this with 3D printed artificial limbs. And so she's wearing this with pride, and then seeking out like the most.
Is it latest... Amy Purcell or something like that?
Yeah, I believe
yes.
we may have met at a conference, or she gave a talk at one of these robotics conferences, no less. And so she's already getting herself out there to the robotics community to show ways that we can integrate this into our sense of art and fashion. I think it's pretty cool.
All right, let's try to get one or two more questions, because I do know a couple people have been, I believe you've been waiting for a bit to ask a question, then we'll come to the front in the blue shirt. So in the black shirt, yeah, I'm looking right at you. Yeah, there you go. So we'll take a couple more questions, and just to remind our debaters that then we go into our closing comments, where you have to really nail your point. And then we do a vote from the audience in terms of how their opinion has changed. And then afterwards, we do a quick debrief. We can all breathe a sigh of relief, and you can tell us how you really feel about all of this. All right.
Right. So some of the bionic parts that you mentioned are kind of reversible, right? Like the lenses, the things that measure. What about the other parts that are not reversible? Like if I'm going to replace a limb or something, this is not replaceable, right? Or is it? So that's the first question. And then if it's not, and the person who replaced that limb is not able to operate it well, or is not happy with it, what would be the consequences? Thank you.
Anyone, just when you're saying that question, I'm having a total nightmare scenario of what's happening in Ontario, of right to repair, and the fact that we wouldn't be able to repair our own bionic limbs and how bad that would be. But anyone want to tackle that one?
I think, are you alluding to kind of a scenario where, maybe, for instance, right, the hand that I have now, I get rid of that hand and I get a new bionic hand, and then I don't like it? Is that, yeah, I mean, that doesn't sound good. That does sound like a nightmare scenario. This is again where I know I've said this a zillion times, health practitioners. I would trust a health practitioner to do a risk benefit analysis of that decision. And my guess is that the risk benefit analysis would be pretty high on risk and pretty low on benefit for someone who already had a hand that they were using for most things, right? That risk benefit analysis could change under other circumstances, but I think that that's where, again, yeah, I would trust some of the metrics that have been developed in research and deployed with people, and trust that relationship that I had with a health practitioner to make a decision there. And that is hopefully how we would not get to that scenario in the first place.
I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I agree that the healthcare professional can help us to understand a lot of the potential consequences of our decision. But bionic parts will need to be replaced at some point, at different points, and it will cost money. So that when you get a bionic part, presumably then you'll be paying more and more and more. It's not just a one-time fee. So again, that restricts the access to that part more to the wealthy, and that's a concern.
I would recommend the extended warranty on your bionic parts.
I want to add one thing to that note. There are efforts for quote unquote open source exoskeletons and open source prosthetics. Elliot Rouse's lab at the University of Michigan is a big proponent of that. So there's already kind of work in place to avoid some of these proprietary effects for especially prostheses and open that up to everybody.
Question in the blue here.
Okay, and talking about augmentation and access, thinking about the university, when we get to a point where we can have cognitive enhancement technologies, how are we going to manage that in terms of admissions and fairness and equality of access? And are we going to treat it like they treat steroids for athletes?
So you said cognitive enhancements, right? So one response is moral enhancements. So that as we get smarter, we can enhance ourselves morally too, so that we make more virtuous decisions. And there's a whole a lot of people who are arguing in favor of these emerging technologies for morally enhancing us. I think it's fraught with all kinds of complications there. I think the only ones, who'd be inclined to get such moral enhancements might be the ones who don't need them. But cognitive, who can access them, and then the divide that could create too. Absolutely, with some people becoming quicker thinkers and able to process more efficiently and address more issues at once compared to other people who do not access those enhancements. What kind of divide do we get there? Good point. Especially at universities, right, with academics and especially with merit. So who wants more merit?
That's actually, I'm going to segue off that point because I'm going to reach really far into the idealistic future, and maybe be a little bit more controversial again. I think one solution to that would be to overhaul our approach to the academic industrial complex and be more of a human society and a civilization than we are this competitive society that we are now. So in academics now, you're rewarded for competing with your peers, for showing how well you stack up against others versus what the contribution is to humanity, period, flat out. So to me, a cognitive enhancement would be a benefit to society, to all of us. And maybe if only some of it get these enhancements versus others, there's some control to be put in place to say that we don't worship this person as our new leader, as our new God, or whatever you want to call it. But because they have all the answers, because they can think quickly, if we can sort of evolve past that, then we become sort of a better civilization. So my very long-term idealistic future is we could embrace these enhancements if we also at the same time overhaul our approach to how we value the effects of those enhancements. And so right now we value these differences in, I think, not the most healthy way in terms of being competitive. So that's a challenge. I don't know how long it's going to take to overcome, but we can, before we even get to the cyborg debate, we could also already try starting to address that as we are now, I hope.
Excellent. All right, that's going to close out our audience Q&A, but feel free to come up to our debaters if you have questions after we wrap up our session. We do now want to go to our closing arguments. So we're going to give each of our debaters, about 3 minutes for some closing comments. I think it's only fair, Matt, that we start at your end. And would you like the clock to?
Sure. We have 5 minutes again.
Yeah, we can do 5 minutes. Do you guys each have 5 minutes? Up to 5 minutes. If you don't feel the time, that's no problem.
Up to 5 minutes.
Yeah, up to 5 minutes. And I'm going to come over and then we are going to do no pressure, but then we're going to get the audience online and in person to vote again and see how you swayed the votes. Okay, so this is your chance to get them to come to your team.
Okay. Hopefully I won't take up the whole 5 minutes. I'm just going to try to reiterate and cover the points I started with a little bit more emphasis. We're already cyborgs. I think we're glued to our phones. We're addicted to our phones, whatever you want to say. But it's here to stay, and I imagine it's going to be in the future, only getting worse if you're against that sort of thing. Or it can only get better. It can only get more powerful as we improve our technology. So in some sense, we've already chosen the path of the cyborg. My second point is, if my truck can live forever, why can't I? I might not be able to live forever per se. I think there's some aspect of humanity, and we haven't really gotten into the brain and how to replicate that and embed that in a computing system. But if most of what fails are my organs before my brain goes out, I would take the chance to see how much of that we can replace and go forward. And then hopefully my truck and I can drive into the future even if there's no gasoline to run it on anymore. I could sit in there happily in my front yard. And then the last point, I'll end super early, is there's some view, maybe if you talk to a medical professional, they have even more of an enhanced perspective of this. We are, in a sense, depending on, it's a little spiritual, but basically just meat robots, as it were. So if anything goes wrong now, we go to the doctor, we go to the surgeon, and they do what they can in the biological context to fix us. And they try their best to use the same materials and the same methods that our body uses to grow replacement parts. And some people's approach to fixing biology is to emulate that directly. And so 3D printed organs is a thing, bone scaffolds to have your bones self-heal over wounds is a thing. And so there's already this approach to doing it biologically. I don't see much of a difference between augmenting that with even more and more artificial components, because again, and the point I want to end on is we are just meat robots. We're essentially just machines of different compositions of different components and parts. And as we get a better understanding, we'll have a better ability to replace those parts. And again, I want to live long enough to see a hoverboard. I was disappointed that Back to the Future didn't come as soon as they predicted it would. I was really looking forward to that. I also tasked it as my own goal to be the reason, to be the driving force behind that. So I'm not totally disappointed that the opportunity is still there for me to build that and design that. It's a little outside the scope of soft robotics, but somehow we'll find a way. My students are here, they're listening. So if you really want to get on my good side, come up with a nice hoverboard or flying car technology. But that's it. I think it would be very beneficial in a lot of ways, not even counting all the people who would regain abilities that are lost through this type of technology. So hopefully we see it.
You need it.
Thank you so much. So yeah, to reiterate the arguments that were already posed, we already are becoming cyborgs, especially through restorative technologies. There are areas in our lives where I think many of us would accept augmented function compared to what we have now. I gave some examples like contact lenses that adjust to lighting conditions. There might be cases in the future where we might have to for instance, personal identification. I don't know. And lastly, there are regulatory bodies and medical practitioners that we can interface with as we navigate some of these more kind of fine issues with adoption of bionics. That doesn't mean that we have to stop adopting them altogether. And in fact, we are doing that right now. I would also add, a lot of the counter arguments against using bionics at all were kind of about privilege, right? Who's going to get something first? That's not a cyborg specific argument. That's a lot of devices where we're having to answer those questions. And I think the fact that question exists and that it is a tough one and that it's an unfair one to many people doesn't mean that we should abandon adoption or research in that area. And in fact, it could even be improved by mass adoption because costs might go down like they have for computer parts. Other kind of questions were about obsolescence and information and privacy. Those are also things that we're already facing in other spheres too. And again, it's not a point specifically against becoming cyborgs. It's a point about kind of larger things in the world. There are also, I want to highlight again, some efforts against that in this space, such as open source exoskeletons, where, you can, build the parts, you have a full plan, you have your code for the software, and you can do that by yourself if you want to. The last big argument that was raised against becoming cyborgs was about form versus function in general. Should I pick something that functions or, be pressured to pick something that looks pretty? Are people going to other me for having this device or for the way it looks? That's actually something that also might improve with further research and further adoption into this area. The more we might be used to seeing people with prosthetics, the less we might other them as time goes on. And the more variety there is in the bionics that are available, the more we can make choices about how we express ourselves aesthetically with them, instead of being forced to have something that, we don't like the look of ourselves. So yeah, in conclusion, we're kind of already there, and we're grappling with issues that are not necessarily always specific to cyborgs, and where development of bionic technologies might actually improve where we stand. Thank you.
You're fine.
13 years ago, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and my wife, who's a Queen's nurse, and I were able to get him into a clinical trial at diagnosis of an early artificial pancreas. So we were at the very forefront. He was the first boy, the youngest, the fourth ever in the world to have one of these technologies. So, maybe it's clear that I'm actually a bit of a fan of these things, but I wanted to share this experience because it informed my appreciation of the technology versus the human and societal impact of that. So he was 10 when he was diagnosed. And when you're a 10-year-old, you're still quite able to be parented. And so that changes over time as they become developing their own self-identity and peer groups. So what worked very well initially turned out to be extremely difficult for us to manage as a family. And an example that I've raised a couple times is the notion of alarming and remote monitoring and being a helicopter parent with all the best intentions. When you mentioned open source. So when my son was diagnosed, I was working for General Electric on remote monitoring of gas turbine combined cycle power plants. And I found it incredible that I couldn't monitor my son's diabetes from 30 feet away in his bedroom. And I thought, there's no technical limit for that. Why hasn't this been created by the medical device establishment? And they hadn't identified that need, which I thought was incredible. So I actually hacked the competitor's medical device to do this. We reverse engineered it, took advantage of a cybersecurity flaw, and created an open source. We open sourced this thing. It's called Night Scout. You can Google it. And we created this movement called We Are Not Waiting, with the pretense of we are not waiting for a medical device or regulators to meet our needs. The unintended consequence, there were two unintended consequences of this. One is my son finally just rejected the helicopter parenting and said, I'm going to not use these technologies anymore because I don't want this invasiveness. So this is when it really hit home for us that technology is not neutral, that this has profound implications. And it's pretty scary when you no longer have technology like this. It'll kill you, dead in bed phenomenon. So anyway, that was one of the unintended consequences of this technology was it was messing with his identity and embarrassment at school and the beeping and buzzing and parental but the other thing that really was an unintended consequence, this remote monitoring open source, they took it one step further into open source automated insulin delivery. So there's a whole group of people hacking insulin pumps now, delivering therapy, not just doing a fairly benign thing of remote monitoring. And this started small. And now there's about 10,000 people doing this, and the FDA and Health Canada has no purview over this because it's not a commercial. They only can regulate commercial entities. So this is creating a huge challenge of what happens when somebody sees about these technologies on Facebook or some group and says, I want what's best for my child. I'm going to go download from GitHub and hack this pump. And the FDA is terrified by this. They are busy closing these cybersecurity. So I just wanted to summarize by saying I actually am a proponent of cyborgs. I have just witnessed firsthand what the social and societal and personal implications are of this. And I think we have a long way to go.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yes. My main concern is with the gaps that we have between the technology we're creating and catching up with other social issues and the impact that that gap will have and is having on all of us. So when we hear that regulatory bodies aren't keeping up with all the issues that are coming up with this often wonderful technologies, this is a big cause for concern. And I think that at the bottom of a lot of these issues and questions that we're raising here is the question of core values. What are our values that are informing the development and the usage of these technologies? When our core values are pretty clearly oriented towards care and the interdependence of life and supporting each other, that changes how we use these technologies and even what technologies we choose to create and invest our resources in. Whereas when we're most concerned and dedicated to the core value of making money and an extreme individualism and extreme focus on individual choice, then the technologies, I think, get used differently and give rise to problems that widen the gap between the privileged and the unprivileged. Right now, we're still seeing lots of people in the world who don't have adequate access to internet. Well, that, of course, affects almost all of these parts in different ways and who can access that. So we need to take a step back and look and see, how these bigger issues of access really do affect intensely the development of technology, whether or not we might be in theory for or against the technology. So the gap between the rich and the poor, the privileged, the unprivileged is huge. The lack of intentionality around our core values, I think, is a big problem. I'd love to see more conversations about values, more deliberate conversations, and that may help our regulatory bodies too to move along in a bigger way than we are seeing right now. We need to really unpack what needs fixing, what we want to change about us and why. And again, that has to do with the values. So what do we think of aging? Do we want to cure aging? Is aging a disease that we want to cure? What happens if we manage to cure aging with overpopulation and all those issues? Affordable housing, we're seeing a big problem with housing right now. Even if we think too that eventually these technologies will become accessible and affordable as the cost comes down. What happens in the meantime? In the meantime, I think what we're going to see is the wealthy living even longer and living even better than those at the other end of that spectrum. And by the point that it actually filters down and becomes accessible, we may see such a great polarization of class system in the world that it may take us a long, long time to repair it. It may never be repaired. So what do we do with that? So for all those reasons, I'm going to say no to access to bionic parts right now. And just to throw in there too, how do we decide about should super rich and privileged athletes be able to use all of these parts to make themselves even better? How do we decide who gets this? We don't have clarity around these issues yet.
Excellent. I would say first up, a big round of applause for all of our debaters. It was a fascinating conversation. So now is the time where we're going to ask the question once again and see if any of our audience members have been swayed. I want to invite the people who are watching online to also think about your answer to this question after you've heard all of our debaters today. So, of course, the question is, would you trade your biological parts for bionic ones? A show of hands if the answer to this question is yes. The debaters do not need to raise your hand. They're trying to sway the vote. All right. Okay, and what about the answer of no? Raise your hands.
I think the yes one.
I think the yes team definitely won. I'm not sure what people online are saying as well, but I would say the yes team are the winners of our debate today. Great job. Now, I do want to say that I was given notes to say this off the top of our debate, but I decided to wait. Just wanted to make it clear that we actually assigned each panelist a position to argue for the sake of the debate. So before we wrap up and head to lunch, my question for all of you, is there anything that you didn't get a chance to say because you had to argue a certain position that you want to get out of the way now?
I would actually opt more for the yes side than the no side, because I do think there's a lot of incredible good, therapeutic good and healing that's happening with bionic parts. So
the one point I was going to bring up that I didn't have a chance to, these are all about automation, about doing things that are performed by humans. And there's this uncanny valley between open loop, manual, and fully closed loop. And this is a very challenging area right now. And you run into things that we're already seeing in other even use of smartphones for navigating in a car, automation de-skilling, loss of situational awareness, mode confusion. Am I driving the car or is the computer driving the car? And so these are the issues I face every day is how do you get from this manual human doing everything to computer doing everything, the uncanny valley and closing that gap. And even looking at more mature industries like commercial aviation, where they're struggling with this right now, where the automation is the problem with cockpits these days, or autonomous vehicles. And what can we learn and apply from those? Because they aren't monkeys or dogs in those situations. There's humans in those situations as well with the same fundamental biases and capabilities. So how do we learn from other industries which are far ahead on this automation journey and apply them to healthcare automated systems?
Audrey, anything you want to mention now? Or are you just enjoying your win?
I'm somewhat more on the no side than I represented. Still mainly on the yes side, but I think one thing that I purposely did not talk about is the mismatch between expectations and reality with some of these devices. People don't get necessarily the same function that they expect from having them. They don't necessarily get the same. They don't become the $6 million man, and they often have to work very hard to learn how to use the devices and learn how to, maybe there was a custom interface that was developed just for one person. And so to learn how to navigate with that. And I think that is a pretty important thing that we need to make sure people understand, either who are not using bionics or who are thinking about it, that, your expectations might be way beyond what this thing actually achieves.
And so going along with that to some extent, I'm still in the yes camp, I would say, with a few more caveats. I think there are a lot of other problems that were highlighted today that show there are things we should solve before we go too far in the cyborg reality. There's also other ways to solve some of these problems that don't require us cutting off our arms and replacing them with hammers and chisels and things. As an example, automation plays a huge role already, but there's earlier today, we heard a talk from a keynote speaker who talked about all the gaps that still exist in automation. But everything that we touch nowadays is manufactured in an automated way. But surprisingly, a lot of it isn't. My first research project was in aircraft automation, aircraft assembly, which is still primarily done by humans. We just don't have the same assembly lines. There's not the same throughput as car assembly lines. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the robotic space that we should probably shore up before we start going too far down this road. That being said, I'd still trust my healthcare professionals to give me their advice to replace what needs replacing if I lose any function in the future. But going along with the personal choice point that was brought up, that's another caveat. Again, I'll hammer on smartphones because I wish I didn't have to carry one around every day, but it got to the point I carried my dumb phone, my flip phone, as long as I possibly could, which is great. Battery lasts for like a week without having to recharge it. You can't ask for that on any device nowadays. And it's just until the carrier no longer accepted 2G. And now you have text and email has to come through on your phone, and multi-factor, your thumbprint is taken by your phone. So as long as this technology doesn't become something that I have no choice about in the future, I'm okay with it. I'll trade my limbs in whatever situation or scenario as it comes up, but I don't want to be forced into signing, sorry, Apple users, an Apple end user agreement that I don't understand, and having to only use a certain connector to use my headphones, which really drives me crazy. Why is it different between my iPad and my iPhone? As long as we can avoid those sorts of things, I think developing new technology for the sake of developing new technology is not an activity I want to be a part of. I think we should develop technology with some amount of focus, and not just making it new because it's exciting. And so we should train our new generations to think more like that. And then I'm all on board.
Very cool. Another round of applause for our debaters.